Sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't becoming a monster. It's remembering you were once human. In a world that judges by appearance, the loneliest souls are often those who've lost everything they used to be. In the town of Valdris, everyone fears Davorin, the cursed knight they call the alpha vampire. His red eyes and dark presence send people running. But Davorin wasn't always a monster. 3 years ago, he was the town's greatest protector. Now he walks alone through the same streets he once defended, watching families hurry past him in terror. Then he meets Elira, a kind herbalist who has also known great loss. When she looks at him, she doesn't see a creature to fear. She sees a man carrying unbearable pain. As winter deepens around them, their unlikely friendship begins to bloom. But can understanding and compassion really break a curse that seems permanent? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The winter morning air in Valdris bit sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke through narrow cobblestone streets. Snow had fallen steadily for 3 days, blanketing the medieval town in pristine white that made even the humblest cottage look like something from a fairy tale. Church bells rang the hour across the valley, their bronze voices echoing off stone walls and thatched roofs, calling the faithful to morning prayers. But not everyone in Valdris answered that call. In the shadows of an abandoned watchtower on the town's eastern edge, Davorin pulled his dark cloak tighter around broad shoulders and watched the townspeople emerge from their homes. Even from this distance, he could see how they moved. Hurried steps, nervous glances toward darkened windows. Children kept close to their mothers' sides. They feared the daylight hours less than the nights, but fear had become their constant companion since his return. The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 years ago, those same people had cheered his name when he rode through these streets. Sir Davorin the Bold, they had called him, the Sword of Valdris. Children had run alongside his destrier, begging for stories of his adventures. Now those same children hid when they heard his footsteps. He touched the broken hilt of his sword, the one artifact from his former life that he couldn't abandon. The blade had shattered the night everything changed, but the steel grip still felt familiar in his hand. It was all that remained of the knight he used to be, and he carried it not as a weapon, but as a reminder of the honor he'd lost. The transformation hadn't been gradual. One moment he had been Sir Davorin, protector of the innocent, defender of the realm. The next, he had awakened to find his reflection changed, his eyes burning with supernatural fire. His strength increased beyond human limits. The curse had taken his mortality and given him something he never wanted, eternal life shadowed by an insatiable hunger. But the worst part wasn't the physical changes. It was the way people looked at him now. Where once he had seen respect and gratitude, now there was only terror. He understood their fear, even if it cut him deeper than any sword ever had. After all, what was he now but the very thing he had once sworn to protect them from? A movement in the town square caught his attention. Through the falling snow, he could see a woman walking with steady purpose toward the market stalls. Unlike the others, she didn't hurry. She didn't glance nervously at shadows or pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders. There was something different about her bearing, a quiet strength that drew his gaze. Elira Thornwick moved through the world like someone who had made peace with sorrow. At 52, she carried herself with the dignity of a woman who had seen enough of life to know that rushing rarely solved anything. Her greying hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her woolen cloak, though well mended, was clean and warm. She walked to her herb shop with the same measured pace she had maintained for the past 15 years, ever since her husband's death had left her alone, but not broken. The shop itself was a testament to her character, small but immaculately organized, with bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters and shelves lined with glass jars containing remedies for everything from headaches to heartbreak. The scent of lavender and chamomile permeated the space, creating an atmosphere of healing that drew people seeking more than just physical remedies. Elira had learned early in her widowhood that grief was not something to be cured, but something to be lived with. She had discovered that helping others with their ailments, both of body and spirit, gave her own pain a purpose. The townspeople trusted her not just for her extensive knowledge of medicinal plants, but for her ability to listen without judgment and offer comfort without empty platitudes. This morning, as she unlocked her shop door and began her daily routine, she was unaware that her life was about to intersect with that of the man watching from the shadows. She lit the hearth, set water to boil for her morning tea, and began sorting through the requests that had been left for her overnight. Mrs. Cobbler needed something for her husband's persistent cough. Young Thomas required a salve for burns from the blacksmith's forge. The baker's wife was expecting her 4th child and wanted herbs to ease the morning sickness. These were the rhythms of Elira's life, small acts of service that created meaning from loss. She had learned that healing others was perhaps the most profound way to heal oneself, though the deeper wounds never fully disappeared. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, she would touch the simple silver ring she still wore on her left hand and whisper her husband's name into the darkness. Marcus had been a scholar, a man fascinated by the old stories and ancient customs that most people in Valdris had forgotten. Their cottage was still filled with his books and journals, written in his careful script and filled with research about local legends, supernatural encounters, and the thin places where the everyday world touched something larger and more mysterious. Elira had kept everything exactly as he left it, though she rarely looked through his papers anymore. The memories were too sharp, too immediate. But Marcus would have been fascinated by the current situation in Valdris. For 3 years now, the town had lived under the shadow of the creature they called the Alpha Vampire. Stories varied depending on who told them. Some said he was a demon sent to punish the town for forgotten sins. Others claimed he was the vengeful spirit of a warrior who had died badly. A few whispered that he had once been human, though most dismissed such talk as dangerous foolishness. The truth, Elira suspected, was probably more complex than any of the stories suggested. She had lived long enough to know that most legends contained seeds of truth, even if those seeds had been buried under layers of fear and superstition. She had also learned that the most dangerous monsters were often the ones that looked perfectly human. As she worked, sorting herbs and preparing tinctures, Elira could hear the sounds of the town coming alive around her. The blacksmith's hammer rang against his anvil in a steady rhythm. Cartwheels rumbled over cobblestones as merchants made their early deliveries. Children's voices called out in the distance, though they were quickly hushed by worried parents. The atmosphere in Valdris had changed dramatically since the Alpha Vampire's appearance. What had once been a prosperous trading town filled with laughter and music had become a place where people locked their doors before sunset and spoke in whispers about things that went bump in the night. The change saddened Elira more than she cared to admit. She remembered when Valdris had been known throughout the region for its hospitality and warmth. Now it was becoming known for fear. Elder Matthias, the town's unofficial leader since the mayor's death 2 winters past, had been particularly vocal about the need to drive out their unwelcome visitor. A thin man with a grey beard and sharp eyes, Matthias commanded respect through a combination of genuine wisdom and stubborn determination. He had lived through enough hardship to know that sometimes difficult decisions had to be made for the greater good. But Elira wondered if the greater good was always as clear as men like Matthias believed. She had seen enough of life to know that situations were rarely as simple as they appeared on the surface. People were complex creatures, capable of both great kindness and terrible cruelty, often within the same day. Why should supernatural beings be any different? A sharp knock on her shop door interrupted her thoughts. Through the frosted glass, she could see the outline of Willem, the town's blacksmith. He was a good man, hard-working and honest, but he carried himself these days like someone expecting an attack at any moment. "Come in, Willem," she called, setting aside the bundle of dried mint she had been examining. The blacksmith entered, stamping snow from his boots and unwinding a thick scarf from around his neck. He was a large man, made larger by the heavy leather apron he wore, but his eyes held the same worried expression that had become common in Valdris. "Morning, Elira. I hope you're well." "Well enough. What brings you by so early?" Willem glanced toward the window, as if checking to make sure they weren't being observed. "It's about my Anna. She's been having the nightmares again. Wakes up screaming about red eyes watching her window." Elira nodded sympathetically. Anna was Willem's youngest daughter, barely 8 years old, and she had been troubled by bad dreams ever since the alpha vampire rumors began spreading through town. "The same herbs as before. If you please, the valerian and chamomile seemed to help last time." As Elira prepared the calming mixture, Willem continued talking, his voice low and concerned. "Elder Matthias called another meeting for tonight. Says it's time we stopped being afraid and started taking action." "What kind of action?" "The kind that involves torches and pitchforks, if I had to guess." Willem's tone was troubled. "I don't like where this is heading, Elira. I've got children to protect, but I'm not sure forming an angry mob is the answer either." Elira handed him the small cloth bag of herbs. "Fear makes people do foolish things sometimes, but it also makes them do brave things. The trick is knowing which is which." "And how do you tell the difference?" She was quiet for a long moment, thinking of her husband's research, of all the stories he had collected about creatures that lived on the edge of human understanding. "I think," she said finally, "that you have to look at the whole story, not just the parts that frighten you." Willem paid for the herbs and left, but his visit reminded Elira of how much tension had been building in Valdris. Every week seemed to bring new reports of strange sightings, unexplained sounds, or simply the feeling of being watched. The townspeople were reaching their breaking point, and when frightened people reached that point, they often did things they later regretted. As the morning progressed, more customers came and went. Each brought their own worries and fears, their own stories about the creature that haunted their town. Elira listened to them all with patience and compassion, offering what comfort she could through her remedies and her presence. But as she worked, part of her mind kept returning to the figure she had glimpsed several times in recent weeks, a tall shape moving through the shadows at the edge of town, never quite close enough to see clearly, but somehow familiar. There was something about the way he moved that reminded her of someone, though she couldn't quite place the memory. Perhaps it was time to stop listening to stories about the alpha vampire and start looking for the truth behind them. After all, her husband had always said that the most important stories were the ones people were afraid to tell. The snow continued falling outside her window, covering Valdris in silence and beauty, while the town struggled with fears both real and imagined. Somewhere in those shadows, Davorin continued his lonely vigil, unaware that his fate was already beginning to intertwine with that of a woman who believed in looking beyond the surface of things. Soon, Very soon, their paths would cross in a way that would change both their lives forever. The wolves came down from the high peaks on the third night of the blizzard, driven by hunger and the scent of easy prey in the town below. They moved like grey shadows through the deep snow, their eyes reflecting the pale moonlight as they searched for food. The pack had been without a proper meal for days, and desperation made them bold enough to venture closer to human habitation than they normally dared. Little Sarah Cobbler had no business being outside after sunset, but at 7 years old, she possessed the kind of curiosity that often overruled common sense. Her mother had told her to stay inside while she helped with the evening service at the church, and her father was working late at his cobbler's bench, absorbed in repairing a particularly challenging boot. Sarah had seen something moving in the snow outside her bedroom window, something that looked like a lost puppy struggling through the drifts. Her kind heart wouldn't let her ignore a creature in need, so she had bundled herself in her warmest cloak and slipped out through the kitchen door, following the small tracks that led toward the forest edge. She was barely 50 yards from her house when she realized her mistake. The tracks were too large to belong to any dog, and there were more of them now, a whole line of prints circling around her in the snow. The wind carried a new scent, wild and predatory, and when she looked up from the tracks, she saw eyes watching her from the darkness between the trees. The first wolf stepped into the moonlight, its lips pulled back to reveal teeth like ivory daggers. Sarah's scream caught in her throat as fear froze her small body in place. More wolves emerged from the shadows, their heads low and ears flattened against their skulls. They had found their prey. From his position on the watchtower, Davorin heard the child's terrified whimper carried on the wind. His enhanced senses had been tracking the wolf pack since they descended from the mountains, and he had hoped they would pass by the town without incident. Now his worst fears were being realized. He moved without conscious thought, leaping from the tower's height and landing silently in the snow below. His vampiric nature gave him speed that no mortal man could match, and he ran toward the forest edge faster than the wolves could react. The curse that had stolen his humanity had at least left him with the power to protect the innocent. Sarah saw the dark figure approaching and felt her terror deepen. Everyone in Valdris knew about the alpha vampire, and now she was caught between wolves and monster with no escape. She closed her eyes and waited for death to claim her. Instead, she heard the sound of combat, growls and snarls that seemed to come from more than just wolves. When she opened her eyes, she saw the cloaked figure fighting the pack with his bare hands, moving with inhuman grace as he tore into the attacking beasts. His eyes burned like red coals in the darkness, but his fury was directed at the wolves, not at her. The battle was swift and decisive. 3 wolves lay dead in the snow before the others recognized that they had encountered something far more dangerous than a helpless human child. The surviving members of the pack fled back to the high country, their howls echoing mournfully across the valley. Davorin knelt beside Sarah, careful to keep his face in shadow so she couldn't see his monstrous features clearly. She was shaking with cold and terror, but she appeared unharmed. A few scratches from brambles, nothing more serious. "Are you hurt, little one?" His voice was gentler than anyone in Valdris would have believed possible. Sarah shook her head, staring at him with wide eyes. "You saved me. But you're the monster everyone talks about." The word hit him like a physical blow, but he kept his voice steady. "Sometimes monsters protect people from other monsters. Can you walk?" She nodded, and he helped her to her feet, careful not to touch her with more than the tips of his fingers. Even through his gloves, he could feel the warmth of human life, and it awakened the hunger he constantly fought to control. But his will was stronger than his curse, at least for now. "Go home," he told her softly. Tell your parents what happened, but tell them the wolves are gone. They won't trouble the town again. Sarah took a few steps toward her house, then turned back. What's your name? He was silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, barely above a whisper, Davorin. She smiled then, the first smile anyone had given him in 3 years. Thank you, Sir Davorin. She ran toward home, leaving him alone with the dead wolves and the weight of memory. Sir Davorin. She had called him Sir, the way people used to, before everything changed. For just a moment, he had felt like the knight he used to be. By morning, news of the incident had spread throughout Valdris. But as stories often do when passed from mouth to mouth, the truth became tangled with fear and superstition. Some said the alpha vampire had summoned the wolves to terrorize the town. Others claimed he had devoured the child and left only blood in the snow. A few whispered that he had saved her, but these voices were quickly shouted down by those who preferred their monsters to remain monstrous. Elira heard the conflicting accounts while treating Sarah's scratches in her herb shop. The child's parents had brought her at dawn, worried about potential infection from the bramble cuts. But as Elira cleaned the small wounds, she listened carefully to what Sarah herself had to say. He was scary at first, the little girl admitted, but he fought the wolves to save me. His eyes were red, but they weren't mean. They were sad. Sad? Elira asked gently, applying honey and lavender to the scratches. Like when Papa looks at Mama's picture, the one from before she got sick. Elira's hands stilled for a moment. Sarah's mother had died the previous spring from a wasting illness that no amount of herbs could cure. The child understood grief better than most adults. What else did you notice about him? He called me Little One, like Grandpa used to. And he said his name was Davorin. Sarah looked up at Elira with serious eyes. That's not a monster name, is it? That's a people name. Yes, Elira said quietly. That's a people name. After the cobblers left, Elira found herself unable to concentrate on her work. The name Davorin stirred something in her memory, a connection she couldn't quite grasp. She had heard it before. But where? That evening, driven by curiosity stronger than caution, she made a decision that would have horrified the other townspeople. She prepared a bundle of healing supplies, herbs for wound care, clean bandages, and a bottle of her most potent pain remedy, and set out through the snow toward the abandoned watchtower. The walk took longer than expected. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the wind cut through her heaviest cloak like a blade. But she pressed on, guided by intuition and the kind of stubbornness that had carried her through 15 years of widowhood. She found him sitting in the ruins of what had once been the tower's main chamber, staring into a small fire he had built from broken timbers. In the flickering light, she could see the damage the wolves had inflicted. Tears in his cloak, dark stains that could only be blood, scratches across the backs of his hands. He looked up when she approached, his red eyes widening in surprise and something that might have been alarm. You shouldn't be here. It's dangerous. Everything worthwhile is dangerous, Elira replied calmly. She held up her bundle of supplies. You're injured. Let me help. I heal quickly. The wounds will close by morning. But they hurt now. She moved closer, noting how he tensed like an animal ready to flee. I'm Elira Thornwick. I tend to anyone who needs healing, regardless of who or what they might be. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the small fire. She saw a face that was undeniably handsome despite the supernatural changes. Strong jaw, intelligent eyes that burned with inner fire, dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that made him seem younger than his years. But more than his appearance, she saw his pain. It radiated from him like heat from the flames. "You know my name already," he said finally. "Sarah told me. Davorin." She tested the name on her tongue, still trying to place where she had heard it before. "It suits you better than alpha vampire." Something that might have been a smile flickered across his features. The townspeople prefer their monsters to have monster names. "I prefer to see the person behind the name." She gestured toward his hands. "May I?" He hesitated, then slowly extended his injured hands toward her. Even through her gloves, she could feel the unnatural coolness of his skin. But she didn't flinch. With practiced efficiency, she cleaned his wounds and applied her healing salves, working in comfortable silence. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why help me when everyone else fears me?" Elira considered the question as she wrapped his hands in clean bandages. "My husband used to say that the most important kindnesses are the ones we show to those who have no reason to expect them. Your husband was a wise man." "He was. Marcus would have been fascinated by you, I think. He collected stories about people caught between the human world and something else." She tied off the last bandage and sat back on her heels. "Are you caught, Davorin? Between worlds?" The question hung in the air between them, like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. But for the first time in 3 years, Davorin felt the possibility that someone might see him as more than just a monster to be feared or destroyed. Outside, the wind howled through the ruins, but inside their small circle of firelight, something new was beginning, fragile as a candle flame, but real nonetheless. "Yes," he whispered. "I think I am." Elira's hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages of Marcus's journal, the leather binding worn smooth from years of handling. She had avoided reading his research for so long that the familiar handwriting felt like a voice from beyond the grave. But her encounter with Davorin had awakened questions that demanded answers, and Marcus had always been meticulous in his documentation of local supernatural encounters. The journal entry dated 3 years ago caught her attention immediately. Reports continue of a knight's disappearance during the expedition to the Blackwood ruins. Sir Davorin the Bold left with 12 men to investigate strange lights and sounds reported by merchants traveling the northern road. Only 2 survivors returned, both speaking of an ancient evil awakened and a curse that transforms the pure of heart into creatures of darkness. The survivors claim Sir Davorin fought valiantly, but was overcome by forces beyond mortal understanding. His body was never recovered. Elira's breath caught in her throat. The timeline matched perfectly. The missing knight from 3 years ago and the monster the townspeople feared were the same person. Marcus had suspected it, had been investigating the connection right up until his death. She read on, finding more entries that painted a picture of her husband's growing fascination with the case. He had interviewed the survivors, collected local folklore, and researched similar curses in ancient texts. His conclusions were both heartbreaking and hopeful. Traditional vampire mythology suggests that those turned against their will retain aspects of their former nature. If Sir Davorin was indeed transformed while protecting others, his essential character may remain intact beneath the curse. The real question is whether such a transformation can be reversed, and at what cost. A soft knock at her door interrupted her reading. Through the window she could see Willem the blacksmith waiting patiently in the snow, his usual worried expression even more pronounced than usual. "Come in, Willem. How is Anna sleeping?" "Better, thanks to your herbs. But that's not why I'm here." He stepped inside and closed the door carefully behind him. "There's talk, Elira. About you going up to the old tower last night." She had expected this. In a town like Valdris, nothing remained secret for long. "Who saw me?" "Young Peter, coming back from checking his rabbit snares. He says you were carrying supplies." Willem's voice was concerned, but not accusatory. "Elira, people are frightened enough as it is. If they think you're consorting with that creature saved Sarah Cobbler's life. I know what the child claims, but you'd rather believe he's a monster than accept that the situation might be more complicated than it appears." Elira closed the journal and faced him directly. "Tell me, Willem, what do you know about Sir Davorin the Bold?" The blacksmith's expression shifted, confusion replacing concern. "Sir Davorin, he disappeared 3 years ago, went on some fool quest to the Blackwood and never came back. What does that have to do with—" Understanding dawned in his eyes. "No, you can't be serious. My husband suspected it before he died. The timeline matches, Willem. The knight who protected this town and the creature everyone fears are the same person." Willem sat down heavily in one of her chairs, the weight of this revelation clearly overwhelming him. "But that would mean God's blood, Elira. If you're right, then we've been trying to drive out one of our own heroes. A cursed hero who still risks himself to protect children from wolves." Elira moved to her hearth and began preparing tea, needing the familiar ritual to calm her thoughts. "The question now is what we do with this knowledge. We tell Elder Matthias. Let him decide. Matthias has already decided. He sees a threat to be eliminated, not a person to be saved." She poured hot water over the chamomile leaves, inhaling the soothing scent. "Besides, we still don't know the full truth. There are pieces missing from this story." Willem was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she had told him. Finally, he spoke again, his voice subdued. "What do you need from me?" "Information, discreetly. Ask the older residents what they remember about Sir Davorin, what kind of man he was before he disappeared, and see if anyone else suspects the connection. And if they do, if word gets out—" Elira handed him a cup of tea and met his gaze steadily. "Then we hope that the people of Valdris remember how to show mercy to their own." That evening, as snow continued to fall outside her windows, Elira found herself reading more of Marcus's research. He had been thorough in his investigation, collecting not just local accounts, but consulting older texts about supernatural transformations. One passage in particular stood out. The old texts speak of curses that can only be broken through great sacrifice, often the willing gift of life force from one who loves the cursed soul truly and completely. But they also warn that such attempts are dangerous for both parties, and failure often results in the death of both the cursed and the one who seeks to save them. Love. The word seemed to echo in her mind as she closed the journal. Could love truly break such a powerful curse? And even if it could, was she prepared for what that might require? A sound outside her door made her look up. Through the frosted glass, she could see a tall figure standing in her garden, barely visible in the swirling snow. Her heart began to race as she recognized the familiar silhouette. She opened the door to find Davorin standing among her herb gardens, his dark cloak dusted with snow and his red eyes reflecting the light from her windows. He looked like a creature from a fairy tale, both beautiful and terrible, human and other. "You shouldn't have come here," she said quietly. "If someone sees you, I know. But I had to thank you. For last night. For treating me like—" He struggled to find the words. "Like a person. Like someone worth saving." He stepped closer, and she could see that his wounds had indeed healed, just as he had predicted. "No one has shown me such kindness since you were Sir Davorin the Bold?" The name hit him like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock and something that might have been hope. Who told you?" "My husband's research. He suspected the truth before he died." Elira stepped out into the snow, closing the door behind her. "You were the knight who protected this town, the man who rode out to face whatever evil had awakened in the Blackwood." I failed. The words came out as barely more than a whisper. I was supposed to protect people, and instead, I became the very thing they needed protection from. "You saved a child from wolves 3 nights ago. How is that failure? That was different. That was you. The real you, beneath whatever curse was laid upon you." She moved closer, close enough to see the torment in his supernatural gaze. "Tell me what happened in the Blackwood, Davorin. Help me understand how we might undo what was done to you." For a moment, she thought he might flee into the night. He stood poised like a wild animal caught between fear and hope. Then, slowly, he began to speak. There was something ancient in those ruins, something that had been sleeping for centuries until the earthquake last spring awakened it. We went to investigate because merchants were disappearing, and I couldn't let innocent people suffer if there was something I could do to stop it. "What did you find?" "A witch, but not like the hedge witches people tell stories about. This was something old and powerful and filled with hate for all living things. She had been trapped in the ruins by some ancient binding, and when the earthquake cracked her prison, she began to feed again." The snow continued to fall around them as Davorin told his story, his voice growing stronger as he finally shared the burden he had carried alone for 3 years, and as Elira listened, she began to understand not just what had happened to him, but perhaps how it might be undone. The ancient binding scroll was tucked between the pages of a treatise on protective wards, written in Marcus's careful hand, but accompanied by symbols that predated any language Elira recognized. She had discovered it while searching through more of her husband's research, drawn by a notation in the margin that read, "Possible reversal ritual requires willing sacrifice and pure intent." The parchment itself felt different from ordinary paper, heavier, with a texture that seemed to shift under her fingertips. The symbols drawn upon it pulsed faintly in the candlelight, as if they contained some residual power from whoever had originally created them. According to Marcus's notes, he had found this document in the ruins of an old monastery, hidden away by monks who had dedicated their lives to combating supernatural threats. Elira spread the scroll carefully across her kitchen table, weighing down the corners with smooth stones from her garden. The text was written in Latin, which Marcus had taught her to read during their early years of marriage, but the magical symbols remained a mystery. Still, she could make out enough of the Latin to understand the general meaning. "For the breaking of curses laid upon the unwilling, let there be found one whose heart burns with pure love, untainted by selfish desire. Let this one freely offer their life essence to restore what was stolen, knowing that such sacrifice may demand the ultimate price. Only through the willing gift of one's mortality can the bonds of supernatural bondage be broken." The implications were clear and terrifying. Love alone wasn't enough. Ujor curse could only be broken through sacrifice, potentially at the cost of the one attempting the rescue. Elira's hands shook as she read the passage again, trying to find some other interpretation, some loophole that might make the ritual less dangerous. A sharp knock at her door interrupted her study. She quickly rolled up the scroll and tucked it beneath a pile of herb catalogues, before opening the door to find Father Benedict standing in her doorway, his usually kind face troubled with concern. "Good evening, Elira. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Of course not, Father. Please come in from the cold." She stepped aside to let the elderly priest enter, noting how he glanced around her home with more attention than usual. Father Benedict was one of the few people in Valdris who still treated Elira with the same warmth he had shown when Marcus was alive. He had been a friend to her husband, often engaging in long discussions about theology and local history. Unlike some members of the clergy, he possessed an open mind about matters that couldn't be easily explained by conventional doctrine. "I've been hearing troubling rumors," he said gently, settling into the chair she offered him. "Stories about you venturing out after dark, visiting places where it might not be safe." "Ah." Elira put water on to boil, using the time to consider her response. "And what do these stories suggest I was doing in these unsafe places?" "Some say you were providing aid to our unwelcome visitor. Others claim you've been researching matters that are best left to those with proper training in such things." His tone remained kind, but there was genuine worry in his eyes. "Elira, I know you have a compassionate heart, but there are some dangers that even the purest intentions cannot overcome." "What if the danger isn't what we think it is?" She turned to face him directly. "What if our unwelcome visitor is actually someone we have a duty to help rather than fear?" Father Benedict was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with the perceptive gaze that had made him such an effective counselor to his parishioners. "You've discovered something in Marcus's papers, haven't you?" There was no point in pretending otherwise. The priest had known her too long and too well. "I've discovered that our monster was once our protector. The creature everyone fears is Sir Davorin the Bold, cursed while trying to save innocent lives." The revelation clearly shook the elderly priest. He crossed himself instinctively, then sat in stunned silence as the implications sank in. "Sir Davorin? But that would mean, dear God, we've been trying to drive out one of the most honorable men who ever lived. A man who is still honorable, despite what was done to him. He saved Sarah Cobbler from wolves, Father. Even cursed as he is, he risked himself to protect a child. And you believe there might be a way to restore him?" Elira hesitated. The scroll hidden beneath her catalogues seemed to burn with possibility, but she wasn't ready to reveal that particular secret. Not yet. Marcus thought it might be possible. He was researching it when he died. Father Benedict rose and moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered town. "If what you say is true, then we face a terrible moral dilemma. How do we convince people to help someone they've been taught to fear? And how do we know that attempting such a thing won't make matters worse?" "We start by gathering those who can be trusted with the truth. People like Willem, who remember what kind of man Sir Davorin was. People like you, who understand that mercy is sometimes more important than safety. And the ritual itself? Even if such a thing exists, the cost is mine to pay." The words came out more forcefully than she had intended, revealing more of her feelings than she was ready to acknowledge. The priest turned from the window, his eyes sharp with understanding. "Elira, you're not just talking about helping a cursed soul find redemption. You're talking about something far more personal than that." She felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassed by how easily he had seen through her. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do. I think you're beginning to care for this man in a way that goes beyond simple compassion." His voice was gentle but firm. "That's not necessarily wrong, my dear, but it does make the situation considerably more complicated." Before Elira could respond, another knock echoed through the house. This one softer, more hesitant. Through the window, she could see Davorin's familiar silhouette waiting in the garden. Her heart began to race, both from excitement at seeing him again and fear of what Father Benedict might do. "That's him, isn't it?" the priest asked quietly. Elira nodded, unable to speak. "Then perhaps it's time I met this cursed knight properly. After all, if we're to help him, I'll need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." She opened the door to find Davorin looking even more haggard than usual. His clothes were torn in several places, and there were fresh wounds on his arms, wounds that hadn't healed with their usual supernatural speed. "I'm sorry to disturb you again," he said, his voice strained with exhaustion. "But something is hunting me. Something that arrived in town tonight. And I don't think I can fight it alone." Behind Elira, Father Benedict stepped into view. Davorin's eyes widened in shock as he recognized the priest, and for a moment it looked as though he might flee back into the night. "Peace, Sir Davorin," the priest said calmly. "I'm here as a friend, not an enemy. And if something is indeed hunting you, then perhaps we should discuss this inside, where we can speak freely." Davorin looked between them uncertainly, clearly struggling with whether to trust or run. Finally, his exhaustion won out over his caution. "There's a traveling priest in town," he said, as he reluctantly entered Elira's home. "But there's something wrong with him. Something dark that hides behind holy words and blessed symbols." "What kind of wrong?" Father Benedict asked, his expression growing serious. "The kind that makes my curse feel like a blessing by comparison." The silver locket glinted in the candlelight as Father Aldrich turned it over in his pale hands, examining the intricate engravings that covered its surface. To most observers, it would appear to be nothing more than an ornate piece of jewelry, perhaps a family heirloom or lover's token. But those with knowledge of the darker arts would recognize the symbols etched into its silver surface, binding runes that had once belonged to the ancient witch who cursed Sir Davorin. Father Aldrich was not the traveling priest he claimed to be. Behind his blessed robes and holy words lay a corruption that ran deeper than any supernatural curse. He had spent decades seeking artifacts of power, collecting them like a scholar might collect rare books. But his intentions were far from academic. Where others saw dangerous relics to be destroyed or contained, he saw tools to be mastered and exploited. The locket had been his prize from the Blackwood ruins, recovered from the witch's remains after her final defeat. It contained not just the key to Davorin's curse, but the power to create new curses, to bind other souls to his will. With it, he could build an army of supernatural servants, creatures compelled to obey his every command. But first, he needed to reclaim his escaped subject. Davorin's resistance had been unexpected. Most cursed souls were grateful for any semblance of purpose, any relief from their isolation and self-loathing. When Father Aldrich had first approached him 2 months ago, offering guidance and spiritual counsel, he had expected easy submission. Instead, he had encountered a will still strong enough to reject the false comfort of servitude. The vampire's recent behavior was even more troubling. Reports suggested he was developing connections with the townspeople, dangerous emotional bonds that might strengthen his resistance to control. Worst of all, there were rumors of a woman, an herbalist, who had shown him kindness and understanding. Such connections had to be severed before they could interfere with his plans. Father Aldrich closed the locket and tucked it beneath his robes, then made his way through the snow toward the center of Valdris. It was time to remind the townspeople that their fears were justified, that mercy was a luxury they could not afford. Meanwhile, In Elira's warm kitchen, 3 unlikely allies sat around the table sharing tea and terrible truths. Father Benedict had listened to Davorin's account of his encounters with the travelling priest with growing alarm, recognizing signs of corruption that went far beyond simple ambition or misguided zealotry. "He calls himself Father Aldrich," Davorin explained, his hands wrapped around his teacup as much for comfort as warmth. "Claims to be a specialist in supernatural threats, sent by the church to help deal with my presence in the town." "The church sent no such specialist," Father Benedict said firmly. "I would have been informed of any official intervention. This man is an impostor." "Worse than that," Davorin continued. "When he touches his holy symbols, I can feel something respond within my curse. Not pain exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if whatever binds me knows him." Elira's blood ran cold as understanding dawned. "He's connected to what happened to you in the Blackwood. He has to be." "But that would mean," Father Benedict paused, the implications clearly troubling him. "That my transformation wasn't an accident," Davorin finished. "That I was specifically chosen and cursed for a purpose I don't yet understand." The 3 of them sat in heavy silence for a moment, each grappling with the weight of this revelation. If Davorin had been deliberately cursed rather than randomly afflicted, it suggested a conspiracy that went far deeper than anyone had suspected. "There's something else," Elira said quietly. She rose and retrieved the hidden scroll from beneath her herb catalogues, spreading it carefully on the table. "I found this among Marcus's papers. It describes a ritual for breaking supernatural curses." Father Benedict leaned forward to examine the ancient text, his scholarly interest overcoming his caution. "This is very old, pre-Christian, by the look of these symbols. Where did Marcus find such a thing?" "In the ruins of St. Crispin's monastery, according to his notes. The monks there apparently spent centuries fighting supernatural threats." Davorin studied the scroll with intense interest, though Elira noticed he was careful not to touch it directly. "What does it say about the process?" "That curses can be broken through willing sacrifice," Elira replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "The life force of one who loves the cursed soul truly and completely." "Absolutely not." Davorin's response was immediate and vehement. He pushed back from the table, as if the scroll had burst into flames. "I won't allow anyone to risk their life for me." "That may not be your choice to make," Father Benedict said gently. "If this ritual represents the only path to your redemption, then I'll remain cursed. I've lived with this burden for 3 years. I can bear it for whatever time remains to me." Elira reached across the table and took his cold hands in her warm ones, feeling him start at the unexpected contact. "What if I told you that I've already made my choice, that I'm willing to take that risk? Then I would tell you that you don't understand what you're offering. I won't be responsible for your death, Elira. I won't carry that guilt alongside everything else. And I won't stand by and watch a good man suffer when I might have the power to help him." Her grip on his hands tightened. "Marcus always said that the most important choices in life are the ones we make for others, not ourselves. Marcus was a wise man, but he wasn't asking you to die for a monster." "You're not a monster." The words came out with such force that both men stared at her in surprise. "You're a man who was betrayed and cursed while trying to protect innocent people. You're someone who still risks himself to save children from wolves, even when the world has forgotten your true nature. If that's what monsters look like, then perhaps we need more of them." Before anyone could respond, a commotion erupted outside. Angry voices and the sound of footsteps crunching through snow. Through the window, they could see torches flickering in the darkness as a crowd gathered in the street. "They're coming for me," Davorin said, rising from his chair. "I should go before—" "No." Elira moved to block his path to the door. "Running will only confirm their suspicions. We face this together." Elder Matthias's voice carried clearly through the winter air. "We know you're harboring the creature, Elira Thornwick. Send him out, and no harm will come to you." Father Benedict moved to the window and peered through the frosted glass. "There must be 20 people out there, all armed, and that travelling priest is with them, urging them forward." "Father Aldrich," Davorin's voice was grim. "He's finally making his move." "What does he want?" Elira asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Me. Bound and compliant, ready to serve whatever dark purpose brought him to Valdris." Davorin looked between his two companions, his expression resolute despite the fear in his eyes. "I won't let him hurt either of you. I'll surrender myself before—" "You'll do no such thing," Father Benedict interrupted, straightening his shoulders with surprising authority. "I may be old, but I'm still the spiritual leader of this community. It's time I reminded them of that." He moved toward the door with purpose, but Elira caught his arm. "Father, wait. What are you planning?" The elderly priest smiled, and for a moment she could see the young man he must have once been, brave, principled, and utterly unafraid of standing up for what was right. "I'm going to do what priests are supposed to do, my dear. I'm going to shepherd my flock away from the wolves." The vial of consecrated holy water caught the torchlight as Father Aldrich held it aloft, his voice carrying clearly across the snow-covered square. To the gathered townspeople, it appeared to be a symbol of divine protection, blessed water that would shield them from supernatural evil. They couldn't see the faint green tinge that marked the liquid within, or detect the bitter almond scent that would have warned of the poison it contained. Father Aldrich had spent years perfecting this particular deception. The holy water was indeed consecrated, but he had added his own ingredients, compounds that would weaken vampiric resistance, without killing outright. A few drops would leave Davorin vulnerable to his control, while a larger dose would render him helpless for capture. "Good people of Valdris," Father Aldrich called out, his voice ringing with false authority. "Tonight we cleanse our town of the evil that has plagued it for too long. But we must be cautious. The creature has seduced one of your own, turned her against you with its dark influence." Elder Matthias stood beside him, his weathered face grim with resolve. The old man genuinely believed he was protecting his community, unaware that he was being manipulated by the very evil he sought to destroy. "Elira Thornwick has harbored the monster. She has put all our lives at risk with her misguided compassion." Inside the cottage, Father Benedict listened to the crowd's growing anger with increasing alarm. Through the window, he could see Willem the blacksmith among the gathered villagers, his face conflicted as he held a torch with obvious reluctance. Other familiar faces stared back at him, people he had baptized, married, and comforted in their times of grief. Good people, driven to dangerous action by fear and lies. "I know these people," Father Benedict said quietly. "Many of them have struggled with their consciences about this. If I can reach that doubt, remind them of their better natures—" "The false priest won't allow that," Davorin interrupted. "Whatever power he wields over my curse, he can use it to influence their emotions as well. I can feel it even now, waves of hatred and fear that aren't entirely natural." Elira moved to the window beside Father Benedict, studying the crowd with growing understanding. "Look at their eyes. They're too bright, too focused. This isn't normal mob behavior. They're being manipulated. All the more reason for me to surrender," Davorin said, moving toward the door again. If I'm gone, the compulsion will fade, and they'll return to their senses. And then you'll be at the mercy of whatever that false priest has planned for you. Elira blocked his path once more, her small frame somehow radiating an authority that gave him pause. No, Davorin. We find another way. Father Benedict straightened his shoulders. Decision made. I'm going out there. As their spiritual leader, I have a duty to protect them from being used for evil purposes. Father, please. My dear, I've spent 40 years tending to the souls in this community. I know each of these people, their fears and their hopes, their capacity for both good and evil. If anyone can reach them, it's me. He moved toward the door with quiet determination. And if I fail, at least I'll have given you time to escape. Before either of his companions could stop him, Father Benedict stepped out into the winter night. The crowd turned toward him, their torch-lit faces eager for violence, but their expressions softened slightly when they recognized their priest. Father Benedict, Elder Matthias called out, relief evident in his voice. Thank God you're safe. We were worried that the creature might have harmed you. The only creature here is the one hiding behind false holy orders, Father Benedict replied firmly, his gaze fixed on Father Aldrich. This man is not what he claims to be. Father Aldrich's smile remained perfectly serene, but Davorin, watching from the window, could see the calculation in the impostor's eyes. I understand your confusion, brother. The vampire's influence can be quite subtle. But surely you can see the danger this creature poses to your flock. What I see is a man using fear to manipulate good people into committing acts they'll regret for the rest of their lives. Father Benedict moved closer to the crowd, speaking directly to faces he had known for decades. Willem, do you remember when your Anna was born? How we prayed together through that difficult night. The God we prayed to doesn't ask us to hate what we don't understand. Willem's grip on his torch wavered slightly. But Father, the creature is dangerous. The creature saved Sarah Cobbler from wolves. How is protecting a child an act of evil? The devil can appear as an angel of light, Father Aldrich interjected smoothly. One good deed doesn't erase the fundamental corruption of an undead soul. And what of your own soul? Father Benedict challenged, turning to face the impostor directly. I've seen no credentials from the church hierarchy. I've received no communication about your supposed mission. Yet you appear in our town speaking with authority you haven't proven you possess. For the first time, Father Aldrich's composure cracked slightly. His hand moved instinctively to the hidden locket beneath his robes, and Davorin felt a corresponding surge in his curse, a reminder of the bonds that still held him. Your local church records are hardly relevant to matters of such supernatural significance, Father Aldrich said, his voice carrying a subtle edge that made several townspeople step back unconsciously. Perhaps not. But this is. Father Benedict reached into his own robes and produced a letter bearing the official seal of the diocese. I sent word to Bishop Carell the day you arrived, describing your claims and requesting verification. His response arrived this afternoon. He unfolded the letter and read aloud. No specialist in supernatural matters has been dispatched to Valdris. Any individual claiming such authority without proper documentation should be considered suspect and potentially dangerous. The effect on the crowd was immediate. Uncertainty replaced blind anger as the townspeople looked between their familiar priest and the stranger who had stirred them to violence. But Father Aldrich was far from defeated. Lies and forgeries, he declared, raising the poisoned vial higher. The vampire's corruption runs deeper than I thought, if it can influence even official church communications. Inside the cottage, Elira watched the confrontation with growing dread. He's not going to give up, And that vial, there's something wrong with it. The liquid doesn't look right for holy water. Davorin's enhanced senses confirmed her suspicions. Poison, specifically designed to affect my kind. His voice was grim as understanding dawned. He means to weaken me, not destroy me. Whatever he has planned requires me to be alive, but helpless. Then we can't let him succeed? Elira moved away from the window, her mind racing through possibilities. The scroll, it mentioned that curses can be broken through willing sacrifice. But what if that same principle could be used to strengthen rather than break supernatural bonds? What are you thinking? That if I can channel my life force to you willingly, it might counteract whatever poison he's planning to use, at least temporarily. Davorin stared at her in horror. Absolutely not. You're talking about the same ritual that could kill you. I'm talking about using part of the ritual, not the whole thing. Enough to give you the strength to fight back, but not enough to... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Outside, Father Aldrich's patience was wearing thin. The crowd's certainty was crumbling under Father Benedict's steady logic, and soon they would begin to question everything he had told them. It was time for more direct action. Enough debate, he declared, uncorking the poisoned vial. Let God's judgment be revealed. He threw the contents toward Elira's cottage, the liquid splashing across the wooden door and seeping through the cracks. Almost immediately, Davorin gasped and staggered, his supernatural strength beginning to ebb as the poison reached him through the air itself. Now, Elira said urgently, grabbing the ancient scroll from the table. If we're going to do this, it has to be now. The silver pendant felt warm against Elira's throat as she unclasped it with trembling fingers, the family heirloom that had belonged to her grandmother and her grandmother's grandmother before that. She had worn it every day since Marcus's death, finding comfort in its familiar weight, never suspecting the true significance of the intricate symbols etched into its surface. But as Davorin weakened from Father Aldrich's poison, the pendant had begun to glow with a soft, ethereal light, the same light that now illuminated the ancient binding scroll spread across her kitchen table. The symbols on both artifacts pulsed in perfect synchronization, recognizing each other across centuries of separation. Elira, Davorin gasped, struggling to remain upright as the supernatural toxins coursed through his system. What's happening to your necklace? She stared at the pendant in wonder and growing terror. Marcus had given it to her on their wedding day, claiming it had been in her family for generations, but he had never mentioned its magical properties. Now, as she held it up to the candlelight, she could see that the symbols matched those described in the ancient texts about witch hunters, the legendary bloodline that had fought supernatural threats since before recorded history. I don't understand, she whispered, but even as she spoke, fragments of suppressed memories began to surface. Her grandmother's strange warnings about staying away from certain places in the forest, her mother's unusual knowledge of protective herbs and warding rituals, the way both women had always seemed to know things they shouldn't know, to sense dangers that others missed. Your bloodline? Father Benedict said quietly, recognition dawning in his eyes as he studied the glowing pendant. Marcus suspected, didn't he? That's why he was so interested in supernatural research, why he collected all those ancient texts. Outside, Father Aldrich's voice rose above the murmur of the crowd. The creature's corruption spreads even as we speak. We must act now, before it claims more victims. But inside the cottage, a far more dangerous truth was revealing itself. Elira's heritage wasn't just an academic curiosity. It was the key to everything that had happened. The witch who cursed Davorin hadn't chosen him randomly. She had been drawing him toward Valdris, toward the descendant of her ancient enemies, planning a revenge that spanned generations. He knew, Elira breathed, pieces of the puzzle falling into place with horrible clarity. Marcus knew what I was, and he died trying to protect me from whatever this is. The pendant grew warmer in her hands as more memories surfaced, no longer suppressed by whatever mental barriers had kept them hidden. She remembered her grandmother teaching her to identify dangerous plants, not just for their healing properties, but for their protective ones. She remembered her mother's insistence that she learn Latin and ancient symbols, claiming it was important for understanding old recipes and remedies. Most clearly, she remembered the night Marcus died, not from the sudden illness the town physician had diagnosed, but from something far more sinister. He had been researching Davorin's transformation, yes, but he had also been investigating the connection between the ancient curse and his wife's hidden heritage. Someone had discovered his research and silenced him before he could reveal the truth. The false priest, she said, understanding flooding through her like ice water. He killed Marcus. Father Benedict's face went pale. Are you certain? Marcus was getting close to the truth about what I am, about why the witch cursed Davorin in the first place. Father Uldric, or whoever he really is, couldn't let that knowledge become public. Tears burned her eyes as she finally understood the scope of the conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives. My husband died protecting me from a truth I didn't even know I carried. Davorin struggled to focus through the poison's effects, but his enhanced senses could detect the change in Elira's scent in the very air around her. Power was awakening, ancient, dormant abilities that had been sleeping in her blood for 52 years, waiting for the right moment to manifest. What does this mean? He asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. It means, Father Benedict said grimly, that you weren't cursed as punishment or by accident. You were cursed as bait. The witch knew that a descendant of the original witch hunters lived in Valdris, and she needed a way to draw that person out, to awaken their dormant powers. But why? Elira's voice was barely above a whisper. Because, a new voice said from the doorway, witch hunter blood is the most potent source of magical energy in existence. And I've been waiting 3 years for yours to finally awaken. Father Uldric stood in the entrance, having somehow entered without any of them noticing. The mob outside had fallen completely silent, their torches extinguished, their faces blank with supernatural compulsion. He no longer bothered to maintain his holy facade. The power radiating from him was dark, ancient, and utterly corrupt. In his hands, he held not just the poisoned vial, but the silver locket that contained the essence of the original witch's curse. Both artifacts pulsed with malevolent energy, feeding off each other and growing stronger by the moment. You see, he continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than revealing centuries of conspiracy. The old witch was quite clever. She knew she couldn't defeat the witch hunter bloodline through direct confrontation. They were too well trained, too prepared for such attacks. So she devised a more subtle approach. He moved further into the room, and Davorin tried to rise to defend Elira, only to collapse as the poison reached full potency in his system. The false priest laughed at his helplessness. She cursed her greatest enemy, a pure-hearted knight whose suffering would eventually draw out the hidden bloodline. The descendants would come forward to help him, driven by compassion and ignorance of their own nature. And when their powers finally awakened, he gestured toward Elira's glowing pendant. They would be mine to harvest. Harvest? Father Benedict stepped protectively in front of Elira, though he knew he was no match for the supernatural forces at play. witch hunter blood, freely given, can break any curse, even death itself. The original witch bound her essence into this locket, waiting for the day when she could return to a body powered by her enemy's own magical heritage. Father Aldrich's smile was triumphant and terrible. With Elira's willing sacrifice to save her beloved vampire, the witch will be reborn, and I will have earned my place as her most faithful servant. Willing sacrifice, Elira repeated, understanding the final piece of the trap. The ritual requires me to give my life force willingly. If you refuse, your precious Davorin dies slowly from my poison, and I simply wait for the next witch hunter descendant to reveal themselves. There are others scattered throughout the kingdom, though none quite as powerful as you appear to be. The pendant in her hands was now burning with silver fire, responding to her emotions and the awakening of abilities she had never known she possessed. She could feel the power flowing through her bloodline, generations of women who had fought supernatural evil, their strength and knowledge suddenly available to her conscious mind. But she could also feel the trap closing around them. Father Aldrich was right about the ritual's requirements. To save Davorin, she would have to willingly pour her life force into breaking his curse. And once she began that process, there would be no way to prevent the witch's spirit from claiming her body as its new vessel. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. "I'm afraid not, my dear. The magic is quite specific about its requirements." Father Aldrich raised the silver locket, and immediately Davorin cried out in pain as his curse intensified. "But I'm not entirely without mercy. Begin the ritual now, and I'll ensure his suffering ends quickly." "Don't!" Davorin gasped, fighting to speak through waves of supernatural agony. "Don't let them use you. Let me die with honor, rather than become the instrument of your destruction." Elira looked between the man she had come to love and the ancient evil that threatened to possess her soul. The pendant burned in her hands like a star, filled with power she was only beginning to understand. Somewhere in that power lay the key to salvation, if only she could find it before it was too late. "I need time to prepare the ritual properly," she said finally, buying precious moments to think. "Of course," Father Aldrich agreed with false magnanimity. "After all, we want to ensure it's performed correctly. You have until dawn, approximately 1 hour. Use it wisely." He stepped back into the shadows, but his presence remained like a weight pressing down on the room. Outside, the compelled townspeople stood motionless in the snow, their souls trapped as surely as their bodies. Elira clutched the burning pendant and tried to find hope in the growing darkness. Somewhere in her awakened heritage lay the knowledge she needed. She just had to find it before the witch claimed her forever. The restored sword gleamed in the pre-dawn darkness, its blade reforged with blessed silver and tempered with 3 drops of Elira's freely given blood. Willem the blacksmith had worked through the night in his forge, his movements guided by sudden knowledge that seemed to flow from some ancestral memory of his craft. The broken hilt that Davorin had carried for 3 years now supported a weapon worthy of the knight he had once been, a blade that could cut through supernatural darkness itself. Willem approached Elira's cottage with careful steps, the sword wrapped in blessed cloth and his heart heavy with the weight of what they were attempting. Around him, the townspeople moved with similar purpose, each having awakened from Father Aldrich's compulsion when Elira's heritage had fully manifested. The false priest's power over mortal minds had proved no match for the ancient authority that now flowed through the witch-hunter bloodline. "It's beautiful work," Elira said softly, as Willem unwrapped the weapon in her kitchen. The silver blade caught the candlelight and seemed to hold it, radiating a gentle warmth that made the air itself feel cleaner. My grandfather taught me the old ways of smithing, though I never understood why until tonight. Willem's weathered hands showed burn marks from working with the blessed silver, but his expression held deep satisfaction. Some knowledge sleeps in the blood until it's needed. Davorin struggled to sit up from where he lay on Elira's bed, the poison still coursing through his system, but no longer gaining strength. Father Benedict had spent the remaining hour of darkness performing what purification rituals he could remember, while Elira had used her awakened abilities to slow the toxin's progress. It was a temporary measure at best, but it had bought them precious time to prepare. "I can't wield it," Davorin said, studying the magnificent weapon with longing and regret. "The blessed silver would burn my hands to the bone." "Not if the blessing recognizes your true nature," Father Benedict replied, consulting the ancient texts they had spread across every available surface. According to these writings, blessed weapons respond to the wielder's intent, not their supernatural status. A cursed knight fighting for righteousness might find such a blade perfectly usable. "And if you're wrong? Then we'll know very quickly." Outside, they could hear movement as the freed townspeople took positions around the cottage. Elder Matthias had proven surprisingly effective at organizing their defense once he understood the true nature of their enemy. 3 years of fearing Davorin had at least prepared them for supernatural combat, even if their target had changed. "Mrs. Henderson has barricaded the northern approach with her furniture," the elder reported as he entered the cottage. "Young Peter and his father have the eastern road blocked. We're as ready as we can be for whatever comes next." Elira nodded her appreciation, but her attention remained focused on the scroll that contained the ritual for breaking supernatural curses. She had spent the past hour studying every symbol, every phrase, searching for some alternative to the deadly sacrifice it demanded. Her awakened heritage had given her the knowledge to understand the ancient text completely, and that understanding only made the situation more hopeless. "There has to be another way," she murmured, running her finger along the Latin verses that described the transfer of life force. "Some loophole or alternative. Interpretation." "You know there isn't." Davorin's voice was gentle but firm. "I've accepted what's going to happen, Elira. The question now is whether we can prevent the witch from claiming your body when you perform the ritual." That was indeed the crucial question. According to the texts, the moment Elira began channeling her life force to break Davorin's curse, she would become vulnerable to spiritual possession. The ancient witch's essence, bound within Father Aldrich's locket, would attempt to merge with her consciousness and claim her magical heritage for its own purposes. "The locket is the key," Father Benedict said, looking up from his own research. "As long as the witch's spirit remains bound within it, she can't fully possess anyone. But breaking that binding would release her to wreak havoc on the world," Elira finished, "while leaving her free to possess any witch hunter descendant she encounters." "Not necessarily." A new voice spoke from the doorway as Sarah Cobbler entered, followed by her parents and several other villagers. The 7-year-old girl moved with unusual gravity for her age, carrying something wrapped in her small hands. "Sarah," her mother said worriedly, "you shouldn't be here. It's too dangerous." "I have to be here," the child replied with startling conviction. "The nice vampire saved me from the wolves. Now I can help save him." She unwrapped her burden to reveal a small wooden cross, crudely carved but polished smooth by countless small fingers. It was clearly a child's handiwork, made with more love than skill, but as it caught the candlelight, Elira gasped at what she saw. "Where did you get this?" she asked, taking the cross with reverent care. "I made it," Sarah said proudly. After Sir Davorin saved me, I wanted to make something special for him. Mama taught me that crosses protect people from bad things, so I carved one and said prayers over it every night. The cross radiated a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. It was blessed not by ritual or holy water, but by something far more powerful, a child's pure gratitude and innocent faith. Such blessings were mentioned in the oldest texts as being among the most potent forms of protection against evil. "Sarah," Elira said carefully, "what kind of prayers did you say?" "I asked God to help Sir Davorin remember who he really is, and I asked him to protect Sir Davorin from anyone who wanted to hurt him." The little girl looked up at Davorin with serious eyes. "Will it help?" "Yes," Father Benedict said with growing excitement. "Yes, it might help tremendously. Pure intent, innocent faith, and specific protection for the cursed individual. This could serve as a spiritual anchor during the ritual." "An anchor?" Davorin asked. "Something to hold your true identity in place while the curse is being broken. The texts warn that the process can be traumatic enough to shatter the victim's sense of self. But with a focus, point, something that reminds you who you truly are, you might maintain your consciousness throughout the transformation." It wasn't a complete solution, but it was hope where none had existed before. Elira carefully placed the child's cross around Davorin's neck, noting how the blessed silver of the chain didn't burn his skin. If anything, he seemed to gain strength from its presence. "There's something else," Elder Matthias said, producing a leather pouch from beneath his cloak. Old Agnes remembered where her grandmother hid these before the plague took her. He poured the contents onto the table, a collection of small silver amulets, each bearing symbols similar to those on Elira's pendant. The metal was tarnished with age, but the protective power within remained strong. "Witch hunter charms," Elira breathed, recognizing them from her newly awakened memories. "Agnes's grandmother was one of us. She said to give them to anyone who fought the darkness," Matthias explained, "claimed they would know when the time was right." They distributed the amulets among their small band of defenders: Willem, Father Benedict, Elder Matthias, and surprisingly, Sarah's parents, who insisted on staying to protect their daughter's investment in Davorin's salvation. As dawn approached, they could feel Father Aldrich's presence growing stronger. The false priest had spent the remaining darkness gathering his own supernatural allies, creatures of shadow and malice that answered to his dark authority. The final confrontation would not be a simple duel between good and evil, but a battle for the very soul of Valdris. "Remember," Elira addressed the group as they made their final preparations, "our goal isn't to defeat him in combat. We just need to survive long enough for the ritual to complete. Once Davorin's curse is broken, if I survive the process," Davorin interjected. "When you survive the process," she corrected firmly, "your natural abilities combined with a blessed weapon should be enough to deal with our false priest." "And if the witch possesses you during the ritual?" Elira touched the pendant at her throat, feeling the power that flowed through her bloodline. Generations of women who had faced similar choices and made similar sacrifices. "Then you'll have to do what witch hunters have always done when one of their own falls to darkness. You'll have to stop me." The words hung heavy in the air between them, but Davorin nodded his understanding. They both knew the risks, both accepted what might be required of them. Love sometimes demanded the ultimate sacrifice, not just of life, but of the very heart that made such love possible. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten with the approaching dawn. Father Aldrich's deadline had arrived, and with it, the moment when all their planning would be put to the test. "It's time," Father Benedict said quietly, consulting his pocket watch. "The ritual must begin at the exact moment of Sunrise for maximum effectiveness. Elira took Davorin's hand in hers, feeling the unnatural coolness of his skin and the fading pulse of the poison in his system. In a few minutes, she would begin pouring her life force into him, risking everything on the hope that love and sacrifice could indeed break ancient curses. "Whatever happens," she said softly, "remember that you are Sir Davorin the Bold, protector of the innocent, defender of the realm. Hold on to that truth, no matter what else you might lose." "And you remember," he replied, bringing her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss, "that you are Elira Thornwick, healer and witch hunter, the bravest woman I have ever known. Don't let anything take that away from you." The first ray of sunlight pierced the winter clouds, and the battle for their souls began. The ritual circle of binding materialized in the snow outside Elira's cottage, as Father Aldrich began his incantation, ancient symbols burning themselves into the frozen ground with supernatural fire. The carved stones that formed its perimeter had been hidden beneath the earth for centuries, waiting for this moment when the false priest's power would call them forth. Each symbol pulsed with malevolent energy, creating a web of dark magic that would contain and channel the forces about to be unleashed. Elira felt the circle's power pulling at her newly awakened heritage, trying to draw her forward against her will. The pendant at her throat burned with responding heat as her witch-hunter blood recognized the ancient enemy that had created these bindings long ago. "You feel it, don't you?" Father Aldrich called from the circle's center, no longer bothering to maintain his holy facade. His robes had darkened to midnight black, and the silver locket in his hands blazed with the trapped essence of the original witch. "The call of your true nature. Your ancestors fought against this circle for generations, never realizing they were only strengthening it with their opposition." "Don't listen to him," Father Benedict warned, gripping one of Agnes's grandmother's protective amulets. "The circle feeds on doubt and fear. Keep your mind focused on what you're trying to accomplish." Around them, the townspeople had taken defensive positions as shadowy creatures began emerging from the forest. These were Father Aldrich's supernatural allies, beings of darkness that had answered his call for aid. They moved like living smoke, their forms shifting between human and beast as they circled the cottage with predatory intent. Davorin struggled to his feet, the reforged sword heavy in his weakened hands. The blessed silver burned against his palms, but the pain felt clean somehow, a reminder of his humanity rather than proof of his damnation. Sarah's wooden cross rested against his chest, its innocent blessing providing an anchor for his fragmenting identity. "The poison is fighting the ritual," he gasped, feeling the toxin in his system react violently to the awakening magical energies. "I don't know how much longer I can—" "Hold on," Elira said firmly, beginning to trace the symbols from the ancient scroll in the air above him. Golden light flowed from her fingertips, each gesture drawing more power from her bloodline. "The ritual is starting to work. I can feel the curse beginning to weaken." But Father Aldrich was ready for this moment. As Elira's life force began flowing toward Davorin, the false priest raised the silver locket and spoke words in a language that predated human civilization. The witch's essence within the artifact stirred to wakefulness, sensing the magical energy it had waited 3 years to claim. "Now," Father Aldrich commanded, and his shadow creatures attacked. Willem met the first wave with his blacksmith's hammer, the tool blazing with protective light thanks to the amulet he wore. The creatures shrieked as the blessed metal tore through their forms, but more kept coming from the darkness between the trees. Elder Matthias and the other villagers fought with desperate courage, their protective charms giving them strength beyond their years. But they were ordinary people facing supernatural evil, and slowly the creatures began to overwhelm their defenses. "I can't maintain the ritual and fight them off," Elira said through gritted teeth, her concentration split between channeling power to Davorin and protecting the others. "The spell requires complete focus." "Then focus on the spell," Davorin replied, forcing himself upright despite the agony coursing through his transformed body. "Let me handle the rest." He raised the reforged sword, and to everyone's amazement, the blessed silver accepted him. The blade sang with holy light as he swung it at the nearest shadow creature, cutting through its essence like a knife through silk. Sarah's cross burned against his chest, reminding him of who he truly was beneath the curse. Sir Davorin the Bold, protector of the innocent. The swordwork came back to him as Elira's power flowed through their connection, muscle memory from decades of training, honor codes carved into his very soul. He moved between the villagers and their supernatural attackers, his blade carving arcs of silver fire through the darkness. But Father Aldrich was ready for this too. As Davorin fought to protect the others, the false priest began the final phase of his plan. The ritual circle blazed brighter, its ancient stones rising from the earth to form towering pillars of dark energy. "Enough games," Father Aldrich declared, raising the locket high above his head. "Time to claim what belongs to us." The witch's essence erupted from its silver prison in a torrent of malevolent power. 3 years of waiting had only strengthened her hatred, and now she reached across the circle toward Elira with spiritual claws that could tear a soul from its body. Elira screamed as the ancient evil invaded her consciousness, trying to overwhelm her identity and claim her magical heritage. The pendant at her throat blazed like a star as her witch-hunter blood fought against the possession. But the force was overwhelming. "Elira!" Davorin cried out, feeling their connection falter as her consciousness came under attack. The ritual circle was fully active now, its dark energy reaching toward the sky like a beacon of malevolence. At its center, Father Aldrich laughed with triumph as his centuries-long plan finally came to fruition. The true love sacrifice manifested as golden light that erupted from Elira's heart, her willing gift of life force blazing with such purity that the ancient witch's essence recoiled from its touch. This was not the desperate offering of someone seeking to save herself, but the complete surrender of one soul for another, a love so absolute that it transcended the boundaries between life and death. "No," Father Aldrich shrieked as his carefully laid plans began to unravel. The witch's spirit writhed within the golden radiance, unable to claim a consciousness that had already been freely given to another. "This is impossible. The ritual requires reluctant sacrifice, forced conversion." But Elira's heritage had taught her the secret that her ancestors had known. True power came not from taking, but from giving. The pendant at her throat blazed like a newborn star as she poured her very essence into the connection between herself and Davorin, her love burning away the curse that had tormented him for 3 years. Davorin felt the change immediately. The supernatural coldness that had plagued him began to fade, replaced by warmth that spread from his heart to every extremity. His reflection in the cottage window showed eyes that had returned from red to their natural brown, and when he breathed, he could see mist in the winter air, the sign of a living man, rather than an undead creature. "Elira," he whispered, feeling her life force flowing into him, even as her physical form grew pale and fragile. She was giving everything she had to restore his humanity, and he was powerless to stop her sacrifice. The golden light expanded beyond the cottage, washing over the entire village and beyond. Wherever it touched, Father Aldrich's shadow creatures dissolved like smoke in a hurricane. The corrupted priest's control over the townspeople shattered completely, their minds cleared of all supernatural influence for the first time in months. But the witch's essence was not so easily defeated. Denied possession of Elira's body, it turned its malevolence toward destroying everything within reach. Ancient stones throughout the ritual circle began to crack under the strain of containing such concentrated evil, and the very ground trembled with supernatural fury. "If I cannot have the witch-hunter bloodline," the spectral voice howled from the disintegrating locket, "then I will ensure it dies with me." Dark energy lashed out from the collapsing circle, seeking to drain the life from everyone present. Willem collapsed, gasping for breath as supernatural force pressed down on his chest. Elder Matthias cried out as shadow wrapped around his throat. Even Father Benedict staggered under the assault, his protective amulet cracking under the pressure. Davorin rose to his feet, no longer cursed but now fully human and mortal. The blessed sword in his hands felt lighter than air, responding to his restored nature with perfect balance and grace. Sarah's wooden cross had stopped burning against his chest, no longer needed to protect him from blessed silver, but still radiating the pure faith that had helped anchor his transformation. "Your quarrel is with me," he called to the witch's raging spirit, stepping into the center of the failing ritual circle. "I was your prisoner for 3 years. If you want to destroy someone, take your revenge on the one who actually matters to you." The ancient evil turned its full attention toward him, recognizing the knight who had disrupted its original plans so long ago. But what it found was no longer the helpless victim it had cursed in the Blackwood ruins. Sir Davorin the Bold raised the reforged sword, its silver blade catching the golden light that still poured from Elira's sacrifice. Where once he had been powerless against supernatural forces, he now wielded a weapon blessed not just by holy ritual, but by innocent faith and true love. The sword strike that followed was perfect, a thrust born from decades of training and refined by righteous purpose. The blessed silver pierced the witch's spiritual essence, and the creature that had plagued his kingdom for centuries finally met its end. The ancient evil's death scream shattered every piece of glass in Valdris, but as the sound faded, so did all trace of its malevolent presence. The ritual circle crumbled to dust, its dark stones losing their power as the force that had animated them was destroyed forever. Father Aldrich stood amid the ruins of his plans, no longer sustained by the supernatural power he had served. Without the witch's essence to corrupt his soul, he appeared as what he truly was, a broken old man who had traded his humanity for the promise of immortality and power. "It's over," Davorin said quietly, lowering his sword. The false priest posed no further threat now that his supernatural patron was gone. But their victory came at a terrible cost. Elira lay still and pale in the snow where she had collapsed, her life force spent in the effort to save him. The golden light that had purified the entire village was fading from her eyes, and her breathing had become so shallow as to be almost imperceptible. Davorin dropped the sword and ran to her side, gathering her into his arms as the first tears he had been able to shed in 3 years ran down his restored human face. "Elira, please, don't leave me now. Not when we've finally won." Her hand moved weakly to touch his cheek, marveling at the warmth of living skin. "You're human again," she whispered with wonder and satisfaction. It worked, at too great a cost. He held her closer, as if his embrace could somehow keep her spirit anchored to the mortal world. "There has to be another way, some healing that can restore what you've given up." But even as he spoke, he could see the truth in her fading eyes. The true love's sacrifice was complete and irreversible, or so it seemed. Spring came early to Valdris that year, as if the land itself sought to wash away the memory of winter's supernatural darkness with rushing streams of snowmelt and the first brave shoots of green grass pushing through the thawing earth. The sun shone warmer than it had in years, and children played in the streets without their parents' fearful glances toward the shadows. In the cottage where so much had changed, Elira opened her eyes to find sunlight streaming through windows that she had feared she would never see again. The sacrifice that should have claimed her life had instead been transformed by something greater than ancient magic, the collective faith and love of an entire community that refused to let her go. "You're awake," Davorin said softly from the chair beside her bed, his voice rough with emotion and sleepless nights spent watching over her recovery. The man who sat there bore little resemblance to the cursed creature who had haunted Valdris for 3 years. His eyes were warm brown instead of supernatural red. His skin held the healthy flush of mortal life, and when he smiled, it was with pure human joy. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 weeks. Father Benedict said it was touch and go for the first few days, but then something changed. The whole town has been praying for you, bringing food and flowers, taking turns sitting with you when I needed to sleep." He reached for her hand, marveling again at the warmth of her touch. "Sarah Cobbler has been here every day after her lessons, telling you stories and reading from her primers. She was convinced that hearing familiar voices would help you find your way back." Elira turned her head toward the window, where she could see spring flowers blooming in profusion throughout her garden. "The witch hunter abilities, are they gone?" "Not gone, but changed. Father Benedict thinks the sacrifice transformed them from something destructive into something purely healing. You've been glowing with gentle light ever since you woke up. Not enough to be frightening, just enough to make everyone feel better in your presence." She could feel it now, a warm current of energy flowing through her body like sunlight in her veins. It was different from the ancient power that had awakened during the crisis, gentler, more nurturing, focused on healing rather than fighting. And Father Aldrich? Gone. He left Valdris the morning after the ritual failed, looking older than his years and broken in spirit, without the witch's power to sustain. Him! He was just a sad old man who had lost everything he thought he wanted. Davorin's expression grew thoughtful. I almost felt sorry for him. The cottage door opened to admit Father Benedict, carrying a steaming bowl that filled the room with the scent of healing herbs. His face lit up with joy when he saw Elira sitting up and alert. "Welcome back, my dear. You've given us quite a scare." He set the bowl on the bedside table and felt her forehead with a professional touch. "The fever broke completely 3 days ago, but we wanted to be certain you were truly on the mend before celebrating. What about the townspeople? I remember shadow creatures. Everyone survived, thanks largely to your sacrifice and Davorin's protection. Willem has a few scars he's quite proud of, and Elder Matthias claims the experience took 10 years off his life, but restored his faith in the process." Father Benedict chuckled. "The man has become quite the evangelist for showing mercy to those who are different." Over the following days, as Elira's strength returned, she began to understand the full scope of how their victory had changed Valdris. The fear that had gripped the town for 3 years was gone, replaced by a community spirit stronger than anything they had known before. People who had once crossed the street to avoid each other now worked together on common projects. Children played freely, and their laughter rang through streets that had been silent too long. Willem the blacksmith had commissioned a commemorative plaque for the town square, depicting not the defeat of a monster, but the redemption of a hero. It bore a simple inscription: "In memory of Sir Davorin the Bold, who never lost his honour, and in honour of Elira Thornwick, who reminded us that love conquers all." "They want to hang it right next to the old statue of St. Crispin," Willem explained during one of his visits. "Elder Matthias says it's appropriate, since both stories are about people who sacrifice themselves for others." The wedding took place on the first day of summer, in the same church where Father Benedict had served his congregation for 40 years. It was a simple ceremony by royal standards, but the entire town turned out to witness the union between the former vampire knight and the healer who had saved his soul. Sarah Cobbler served as flower girl, scattering petals from Elira's own garden while beaming with the satisfaction of having played a crucial role in bringing the bride and groom together. The wooden cross she had carved still hung around Davorin's neck, now joined by new wedding bands crafted by Willem from silver, blessed not by ancient rituals, but by the joy of an entire community. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if I hadn't gone to treat your wounds that first night?" Elira asked, as they danced to music played by the town's small but enthusiastic band. "Every day," Davorin replied, spinning her gently under the stars that shone down on their celebration. "But then I remember that you're exactly the kind of person who would always choose to help someone in need, no matter who they might be. So I think we were destined to find each other eventually. Destiny had help," she laughed, "from a 7-year-old girl who believes in redemption, a blacksmith who remembers ancient crafts, and a priest who knows when to trust his heart over his fears." Around them, the people of Valdris celebrated not just a wedding, but their own transformation from a community ruled by fear to one guided by hope. The darkness that had threatened to consume them was gone, replaced by the kind of light that comes from ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary things for love. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Elira and Davorin stood together in their garden, surrounded by flowers that bloomed more beautifully than ever before. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and adventures. There were rumors of other supernatural threats in distant kingdoms, and they had already received requests for help from communities facing their own dark mysteries. But tonight, they were simply a man and woman who had found each other across the space between hope and despair, proving that even the strongest curses could be broken by the willing sacrifice of a heart that loved without condition. The cottage glowed softly in the darkness, a beacon of warmth and welcome that would guide other lost souls home for years to come.